Hey everyone, and welcome back to our coverage of the 160th anniversary of the Overland campaign. We're here at Spotsylvania, and we're about to talk about what William Motter, Civil War historian, termed one of the classic infantry assaults, and that is Upton's attack on the night of May 10th against the muleshoe salient here again at Spotsylvania Courthouse. And here is the subject of our video, or one of the subjects of our video, Emory Upton. Now, to tell you a little bit about Upton, he's from Batavia, New York. He went to Overland College in Ohio. He graduated in the May 1861 class from West Point, and he's going to be a staff officer and artillery officer early on in the war. He's actually on Daniel Tyler's staff at 1st Manassas, where he will be slightly wounded, and he's going to command a battery throughout the Peninsula Campaign and in the 7 Days battles. In the fall of 1862, he's going to be promoted to the rank of colonel and receive command of the 121st New York Infantry. And Upton was always known as a strong, rigid disciplinarian, and he's going to instill that discipline into the 121st New York. And pretty soon, throughout the Army of the Potomac, that regiment is going to become known as Upton's Regulars. And Upton's going to lead his regulars at Chancellorsville. They're going to sustain a tremendous amount of casualties during the fighting at Salem Church. Upton is then going to go on, and in the fall of 1862, late in the fall, he's going to play a prominent role in the Battle of Rappahannock Station in November of 1863. But it's here at Spotsylvania where Upton's star really starts to ascend. He had been an up-and-comer through the ranks of the Army of the Potomac over the previous 2 years, but it's here at Spotsylvania that he's going to lead an attack on the night of May the 10th that is really going to see him rise in the eyes not only of the soldiers that he commands, but as his superiors as well. Now, I'm going to bring Chris White onto the camera to talk a little bit more about the attack and some of the controversy that that surrounds it. Was this Upton's idea? Were these men looking back? Were they applying the lessons learned of the past in their personal and professional experiences? And as we do that, we're going to take a walk down here, and I'm going to ask Andy to pan up against this sign here. You see wartime road used by Upton. This is not actually the road that Upton used, although this will link into the actual road that he used from the Shelton House to move closer toward the muleshoe salient in preparation for that attack. This road was actually put in the 1930s when the Civilian Conservation Corps was here. They put in this road. They paved modern Grant Drive, which was actually a wartime road at the time of the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse. But with all that being said, let's take a walk down this road, and I'm going to bring on Chris White.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, everybody, for watching. Please click that subscribe button, that like button here on YouTube, and check out everything we do over at battlefields.org. So as we're walking along through the woods here at Spotsylvania Courthouse, it is May 10th, 1864, and the Confederates have put up a defensive line. It's a fixed fortified position that is off in that direction, which is roughly towards the south-southwest, the way the camera is facing right now. So we're marching towards the Confederate lines. And throughout May the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th, Ulysses S. Grant, the federal commander here, is starting to get a feel for the Army of the Potomac, Lincoln's principal army in the Eastern Theater, and he's figuring out that these guys have some problems within the high command. It is tough to get some of their corps commanders motivated to move quickly. It's a good fighting force, solid fighting force, but there are some hiccups with this chain of command. And he's also running into the problem, Grant, is that Robert E. Lee is unlike any general that he's fought against so far. Lee is thwarting him at every turn. So this is, even though Grant's overall plan is to keep Lee tied here in Virginia, keep making contact with him so he can't slip away, go on the offensive, and he can keep landing body blows by sending like Ben Butler's army or William T. Sherman's army, David Hunter's armies into the South to try to land body blows as they keep Lee, the best army and the best commander in the Confederacy, tied down. Grant is starting to become frustrated, and he's going to start throwing off his timetables whenever he decides to make assaults. We'll see throughout this campaign, which is about six weeks, and Andy will stop up here, that he likes to make assaults at dawn. Well, this assault that we're going to look at on May 10th is going to take place around 6 to 6:30 on the evening of May 10th. I never believe any of their watches because we don't have standardized time quite yet. We don't have daylight saving. We don't have the railroads really setting everything up, and these guys aren't using batteried watches. They have to wind them. So to some guys in combat, something takes 15 minutes, to others it takes an hour. But it'll be sometime around 6 to 6:30 that evening of May the 10th that this attack will take place. And what Grant is trying to do is shift troops from one part of the Confederate line. The Confederates are running roughly like this on an east-west axis facing towards the north. There's a large U, upside down U in their line known as a salient, portion of their line that protrudes outward. And what Grant is trying to do is find a weak point somewhere along these Confederate lines. Now, what he will eventually come to is that he wants to make an assault at a place called Laurel Hill over on the Confederate right. I'm sorry, the Confederate left, the Union right. He'll also want to make an assault off in those woods about a half mile from where we're standing at the tip or the center of the Confederate line. And then he will try to make an assault in this sector of the battlefield, which we are following along. This is a portion of the Confederate line we'll call Dole's Salient, named after a 29-year-old Georgia lawyer commanding 4 Georgia regiments up inside of Lee's line, roughly 275 yards from where we're standing. And what Grant wants to do is apply pressure at all these points, keep applying pressure, and if he finds one of these weak points, he might be able to break through. In the meantime, he is going to have his men go off the timetable, and Dan can talk about that here in a little bit. Some will attack too early, some too late, some right on time. Things don't go well for him. But in the long and short of things, Emory Upton and the Union 6th Army Corps come up with a plan to attack in this general vicinity with 5,000 Union soldiers, 12 hand-picked regiments. Now, a lot of people will give Emory Upton the credit for most of this attack, and I don't think that that's correct. We'll call it Upton's attack because he absolutely leads it, but in the hours leading up to the assault, Emory Upton doesn't have a lot to do with the initial planning. The Union 6th Army Corps' high command will find a weak point really for Upton. They will hand select the regiments for him, and they will kind of suggest the area and the attack pattern that will take place, but they leave the operational command down to Upton. And Upton will take the time to meet with all of his regimental commanders. Dan will talk about that in a little bit, and really lay this out. It's a well-organized plan. And he's going to use tactics that the Union 6th Army Corps used at 2nd Fredericksburg, Rappahannock Station in November of 1863, of course here in May of 1864, and then later in the war, April 2nd, 1865 at Petersburg. The 6th Army Corps kind of turns into the unofficial strike force or special strike force for the Army of the Potomac. But, you know, people say this is really innovative of Upton and other things, and I disagree with that. I think that Upton is looking back in history. He's looking back to the Greeks, he's looking to the Romans, he's looking to the Spanish tercios, he's looking back to Napoleonic times where we will take 3 regiments, place them across in a battle line, but make them 4 deep. So we'll have 3 regiments in front, and then we will have 3 more lines of regiments stacked up. So we will hit with a fist, and that fist will act like a modern bazooka, which will bore through the Confederate lines. Bazookas don't just explode and create a hole, they actually bore through. So what he wants to do is use his first line to bore through this Confederate line, have 1 regiment swing to the south, which is off to the east in that direction. 2 will swing out to the west. His 2nd and 3rd lines will come up, and then they will seal off that breach from Confederate counterattacks. And then a 4th line will then add its weight to it and can be used as a mobile strike force. What the Federals are looking for in modern military terms is local superiority. They will have local superiority over this battlefield, and they will be able to try to then pile more and more soldiers in. What Upton is doing by looking back in history, he is looking at these great assaults that took place at like Austerlitz, at La Haye Sainte, at Waterloo, other places that punch through using the weight of troops. So also order his men to fix bayonets, and his front line, depending on which regiment you're in, will either not load their muskets, or they will load their muskets, but not put the percussion cap on the cone of the gun so you won't stop and fire. That's the idea here. So let's take a little bit more of a walk before I bring Dan back on. The other thing that I think that is a misnomer of Spotsylvania Courthouse, people are talking about the evolution of warfare, and absolutely, this will be a forerunner of World War I. We'll start to see fixed fortified positions. We will start to see troops trying to make quick assaults across no man's land. And one of the reasons we assault over here for the Federals is that we will only have 200 yards to traverse of open fields. But I think that many of the commanders, both North and South, are trying to look back in time in their textbooks. Dennis Hart Mahan, who is one of the leading experts in military studies at West Point, he went over to France. He basically copied their textbooks, learned about the French defensive positions from the likes of, or about defensive positions that were put together by Sebastian Vauban, Louis XIV's chief engineer, comes back with all these textbooks, and then installs them in the U.S. Army. And he will teach these guys at West Point how to build fortifications. He has chapters upon chapters about how do you build fortifications. But he only has one chapter in one of his books about how to attack them. So one of the things I think Robert E. Lee is doing, as our other commanders, is looking back at their training. Okay, we wanted to be Napoleon, we wanted to be these other great captains of history and go into the open fields and maneuver. This is not working. And now that we have fewer men, we need to look back and how do we stop these men? We start to put in fixed fortified positions. So I do think there's an evolution. There is an adaptation to rifled cannons, mini balls, other things like that. But I do think that we are stepping back in history in some ways, looking back to ancient times and to more modern times for those guys about how do we attack these positions and then how do we establish those fortified positions. So it's just something to think about whenever you're out here on the battlefield. And I'm going to bring on Dan here in just a second. But we are right now at the edge of the wood line in 1864. The Confederate picket line would have been right up into this area. And they would have been at the edge of the tree line, which is about 200 yards off to my right. The trees are a little bit farther in on us today. And those trees themselves would give cover and concealment to the Federals. They would then have only 200 yards to traverse across these open fields when they would strike the Confederate line. And that's what we're going to see here. So Dan, why don't you walk us through a little bit of what Emory Upton is up to, no pun intended, in the 3 or 4 hours leading into this assault. And one thing I do want to say before Dan comes on is I think that Upton's brought in late to this attack because of how arrogant he can be with other people. He doesn't play well with others in and out of his unit. And I really think that one of the reasons they're like, hey, this is what you're going to do is because they're like, I don't want to hear it from this guy. So just assign him what to do. That's just another one of my things, just reading the letters and the correspondence between guys.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And for you fans of the Big Bang Theory out there, Emory Upton is one of the Sheldon Coopers of the Army of the Potomac. He is a very smart individual, very intelligent, and he likes telling people how smart he is. And I think that's one of the reasons why he has such an abrasive personality and why he comes into this attack sort of at the tail end, if you will, of the planning for it. And I'll also mention and tip in off of what Chris said regarding the innovation. I think you're going to see, and please go ahead and watch our videos on the Wilderness, North Anna, the other Spotsylvania videos, and Cold Harbor videos. But at Cold Harbor, Emory Upton is going to continue to innovate really out of necessity as the campaign goes along. Now, as Chris mentioned, Upton is going to plan this attack down to the final detail once he is finally brought into the fold. This is arguably the best planned attack that the Army of the Potomac launches up until this point in time in the war. One of the reasons why Upton is able to plan this attack so thoroughly is that the area that we're standing in is, albeit 200 yards from the Confederate lines, but it's actually occupied by the Federals. Early in the morning of May 10th, George Doles is going to have his picket line punched in by elements of the 65th New York Infantry. So the Federals are going to hold this area, which is going to allow Ronald McKenzie, an engineer in the 6th Corps. You may know McKenzie from the Indian Wars, the Red River War, the Sioux War, if you follow that part of our shared American story. But McKenzie's going to be able to get up here and into this area and actually observe the Confederate line. He's going to be able to report back on it, what it looks like, the strength, the artillery that's up there, as well as the topography, which is going to play into the planning. Because the Federals also have this area, it's going to allow Upton and his 12 regimental commanders, the 12 regiments that will be making this assault, to move up into this area and observe the Confederate lines themselves, and thus allow them to plan this attack down really to the final detail. But as Chris mentioned, this is going to be, Upton's attack is going to be the bazooka of the Union effort out here on the evening of May the 10th. And that bazooka is simply meant to move forward, punch a hole in the Confederate lines, and then hold it long enough for mobile supports to come up and exploit that breach. But there's a problem with that. The problem is about 3/4 of a mile behind the camera in the form of Gershom Mott's division. Gershom Mott is not part of the 6th Corps. He's part of the 2nd Corps. He had not performed well in the wilderness, and Mott is going to be sent out to make to link up with Ambrose Burnside's 9th Corps, which is out on the Fredericksburg Road, modern 208. He's going to be near the tip of the muleshoe salient. And Mott is going to be given orders, as will Upton, to make their attack at 5 o'clock that evening. But something's going to go wrong. The timing is going to be thrown off kilter. Gouverneur Warren, the commander of the 5th Corps, trying to redeem himself for his actions in the wilderness, is going to go to his old friend George Meade and ask him to attack ahead of that timetable at 4 o'clock. Warren's going to get the go-ahead. He's going to attack at 4 o'clock. He's going to be pushed back into his lines at Laurel Hill by 4:30. Orders are then going to be sent out to push that 5 o'clock attack time for Mott and for Upton to 6 o'clock. Upton's going to receive those orders, but Mott will not receive those orders. He's going to go forward as he was originally instructed at 5 o'clock. He's going to be pushed back. Upton's going to go forward at 6 o'clock per his updated orders, not knowing that he will not be supported in the attack. Upton is going to be attacking in a 3x4 formation. It's a very tight formation, susceptible not only to direct fire, but enfilade fire. But because of the planning that goes into this attack and the ability of the Union officers to observe the ground that they're going to be attacking over, Upton is going to be able to adjust to sort of mitigate those risks during this assault. And we're going to talk about the topography once we get up closer toward and outside of the tree line. But right now I'd like to bring on our good friend Chris Mikowski. I think he has something to say.
Topography is kind of the key out here at Spotsylvania, and I'm out here taking this pleasant walk. When we talked about the road that Upton took, we're actually walking on part of the original road trace here. Dan mentioned the path that was added by the CCC. But if you come out through the woods, you can see the road trace going off in this direction. This area was actually crisscrossed by a bunch of lumber roads that are post-war. So kind of piecing together this battlefield over the course of time makes for a really interesting puzzle. If Andy kind of pans off to my left, you can kind of see this big fishbowl area here. This is one of the advantages for Upton to assemble here, because he can be down in this hollow, getting together well out of sight of the Confederates who are going to be behind the camera at this point. Now that does create, though, an acoustic shadow on this battlefield. So when when Gershom Mott makes his attack, as Dan pointed out, these guys down in this hollow can't hear all that action. So Upton doesn't even realize he loses his support because of this topography. Creates all these sorts of interesting problems and opportunities, and these guys are figuring it out on the fly. Also on the far side of the battlefield, we have Ambrose Burnside, who's also launching an attack at 5 o'clock in support of all this. He doesn't get the memo that things have been delayed till 6 o'clock either. Burnside will actually get to the outskirts of the village. He'll have more success here at Spotsylvania than anybody else has. And then he will bog down on his end of the battlefield as well. So we've got all these moving parts with Upton trying to piece together this attack in the middle as Warren goes early and flubs things up, waits for Hancock to come and support him, try to do an attack later on in the day. We've got Gershom Mott, who misses the boat. We've got Ambrose Burnside. The topography is kind of putting all these puzzle pieces together. We're going to look at that a little bit more closely as we head out the woods. Some of the Confederate picket posts are still here. So come out and explore this battlefield, because there's plenty to see, and it really sheds some light on why this is such a confusing battle. Dan?
Thanks, Chris. Let's take a walk up to the sign. I'm going to actually bring Chris White onto the camera to talk a little bit about the interpretive sign that's out here, and it gives a really good You'll find on the sign a very nice map that gives a good overview. It helps you understand the attack a little bit better.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that Chris brought up Gouverneur Warren, Ambrose Burnside. There's a lot of moving parts to this. There's a lot of moving egos as well. Upton has an ego. Warren has an ego. Warren doesn't want to attack. Wants to attack early because of Winfield Scott Hancock being his superior. So he wants to maybe go get the glory at Laurel Hill, and things don't go well there anyways. But there's a lot of moving parts that are taking place. Upton, in the meantime, there'll be a artillery barrage taking place in this area, and the Federals will talk about just how effective it is. What he will put together down in the hollow, as Chris said, right behind this camera to the north of us, he'll put together his strike force. He will have it in four lines deep, 3 regiments across. We are near the historic tree line, so we would have actually been in 1864 in the open, if you ask me, where we are. This map's off just a little bit, if you ask me. And then this is the old road trace that would lead them up into this area. There are some Confederate, what we call today foxholes out here. There's some Union foxholes. And Upton said that they were attacking a portion of the line that was at an angle of the enemy's works near the Scott House, about a half-mile to the left of the Spotsylvania Road. His entrenchments were of formidable character, with abattis in front and surrounded by heavy logs, underneath which were loopholes for musketry. So abattis are pointed sticks, chopped down trees that are pointed sticks coming out at you, help to break up infantry formations. The loopholes that he's talking about, the earthworks are about chest high. That's where you get the name breastworks. Then there would be a hole and then another log on the top called a head log, which simply protects your head so they could fire through that. So the Confederates are well defended. One Union soldier said that when they looked out across these fields, because of the iron in the soil, it was so red it looked like the earth was bleeding. So that's what the freshly churned dirt would look like down here in 1864. It's a hot day. It's unseasonably warm here in early spring for 1864. And Upton will call together all of his officers, and he would repeat the instructions to his command: forward constantly. From the commencement of the charge to the works were carried, no one was to stop and succor or assist the wounded comrades. Another man who's within with the Richmond howitzers, and we'll point out some of the position up ahead, will say, from the Confederate perspective, our position for artillery was anything but a good one. Immediately in our front and 300 yards from our line of works was a body of piney woods, exactly where we're standing, in which the enemy's sharpshooters were posted. Their position is directly behind me. Those sharpshooters, they're just simply infantry that are back there, and from which they poured a continuous stream of Minnie balls. Our 4 guns were posted in the following manner, with 2 3-inch rifles being on the right and 2 Napoleons on the left. The second howitzers, the Richmond howitzers, were in position on our left and some 250 yards to the rear. No other company belonging to our battalion of artillery was engaged. So as I said earlier, this is going to be local superiority. The muleshoe salient is a large U-shape, upside-down U facing to the north. But what Upton is going to hit is just an area a few hundred yards wide and a few hundred yards deep. And if he can make this break in the line, he can then swing in more troops and then maybe keep expanding this and exploit this local superiority and make it into a larger assault. The problems that we have with most Union and Confederate assaults during the Civil War is they lack depth. Pickett's charge was basically a brigade front. Yes, there is usually a brigade coming up in support, say in Pickett's division, where you had Kemper, Garnett in front with Armistead in the rear, but that's a typical formation of a division. There's really not a lot of depth. Then you go off to other places like Murray's Heights here at Fredericksburg. It's wave after wave, not one large wave coming up forward. You go to Gaines's Mill, the largest attack of the Civil War, there is basically Robert E. Lee putting in his entire army, but that's before he had gone in with assault here, another assault here, another assault there, and then finally he just went for broke. So this is what we're starting to look at Spotsylvania Courthouse. Maybe if we start using a concentration of force and we try to hit one point of the line and try to push our way through while keeping the Confederates tied down at other points, we could break this line. It's, as we know, not going to work all that well, but that's the idea behind it. And even though Grant is failing time and again to break through, keep in mind his larger objective is to keep Lee pinned into a place he cannot escape, and he can't go on the offensive and wreak havoc at other places in the north or in the south. So even though he is losing, he's winning by losing. So let's take a walk. Dan, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I'd just like to ask Andy to pan over, and you can just barely see through the sunlight here as it traces its way through the trees. One of the traces actually of one of those old logging roads you can see over in front of the camera. I'd also like to point out this little foxhole here. This is a federal foxhole that was dug probably after the Upton's assault and later on after the fighting here on May the 12th. And as Chris mentioned, come out here, explore Spotsylvania Courthouse, this battlefield, walk through these woods. You're going to find a number of these foxholes that pockmark the landscape. But let's continue our walk on up toward the edge of the modern tree line.
And it's tough to tell, but that is for 2 men, because skirmishers who would be out here working teams of 2 and 4. And you would always have a loaded rifle to the front, and then you would have the other guy loading in the rear. But whenever they came up on the same line, they would be very close to one another, and that's why it's kind of larger than one foxhole. 2 men would have been in that foxhole. Sorry, Dan, go ahead.
Oh, we're making our way up toward the modern tree line, and we're going to come across a monument here. And this is a monument to not only the men who participated in Upton's assault, but also the Confederates on the other side of the lines who engaged in the initial stages of the attack Upton's men. And what I like about this monument is that it's actually a great interpretive tool to use here on the battlefield to sort of explain how finely detailed Upton planned this assault. And we're going to come up here in just a moment, breaking out of the woods and into the sunlight. Gary Edelman is on his way to Gettysburg, but we are here at Spotsylvania exploring Upton's charge. And you can see here the 3x4 formation that Upton utilizes. 5th Maine, 96th Pennsylvania, 121st New York up front. And it's important to note those 3 regiments because, again, Upton plans this attack down to the finest detail. And these regiments have a specific assignment during the assault. The 5th Maine, when they get out here, they strike the Confederate lines. Their orders are to turn left and engage the Stonewall Brigade and move up a ridge that we're going to see in just a moment. The 96th Pennsylvania, 121st New York, their orders are to turn right, engage and neutralize a battery of Richmond howitzers that Chris talked about just a few minutes ago. The 2nd line, 5th Wisconsin, 6th Maine, 49th PA, they're to move up and hold the line, hold that breach in the line that the first 3 regiments created. The 119th PA, 77th New York, 43rd New York, they're to move about halfway across this field, probably into the area that we're standing in right now as supports. And then the Vermonters that Sarah talked about in a previous video in the wilderness, they're to move up to the wartime wood line that we just visited and remain there and to act as orders dictated or as the circumstances dictated. So again, Upton planned this assault down to the finest detail. Chris, do you have anything to add here?
Yeah, all I could think of is Game of Thrones. Hold the door, if you know Hodor. So yes, not making light of this, but that's exactly what I thought whenever you said that. No, I love the idea of this is well planned out. Like Dan laid it out for you. I'm not going to bore you. We come up here, we establish that breach in the line. The only thing that goes against Upton's plan, other than the fact that Confederates don't play along, is that the Vermonters come up into the works a little bit too quickly.
Let's move on over to the other side of the monument, and we're going to see the names of the Confederate brigades that opposed Upton in the initial stages of the assault. What's interesting, I think, about this is that you look at these names: Stephen Ramseur, Junius Daniel, George Doles, James Walker. Within less than a month, all 4 of these men will become casualties. 3 of these men 2 days later. Ramseur will be wounded on May 12th. Junius Daniel will be mortally wounded and die on May 12th. James Walker will also be wounded and out of action on May 12th. George Doles will be killed at Bethesda Church on June 2nd of 1864 during the fighting around Cold Harbor. And we're probably going to talk more about the casualties that both of the armies sustained, especially in the officer corps during the Overland campaign. A tremendous amount of casualties that both armies lose here during the Overland campaign, especially during the first 6 days of fighting. Now, I'm also going to ask Andy, and we're going to looking into the sun here, to pan out across the landscape. Again, Upton is moving forward in a massed formation, tight 3x4 column. And again, this column is susceptible not only to direct fire, but indirect fire. But the ability for the Union officers, Upton, to take a look out here, reconnoiter this ground is going to play dividends for them, because if you look off to the left, you're going to see that the ground rises up and away from us. You might be able to see up toward the Bloody Angle, the monuments, the top of the monuments of the 49th New York and the 15th New Jersey, maybe over to the left, the 126 Ohio. You can see the tops of those monuments, but those Confederates up there in the Stonewall Brigade, they're below those monuments in those entrenchments, and they cannot turn and fire into the left side of this column, rake the column with enfilade fire because of this knoll. Off to the right, we're going to step a little bit out of the wood line. You're going to see the ground slopes down and away from us to another knoll. There's a battery of Richmond howitzers, as we talked about, on the other side of the Confederate lines, right up there near those trees, but you can't see those batteries. If you can't see the batteries, they can't see you. So Upton's going to attack through this ground that we're standing in, through this hollow, and he's protected from his by the ground, by the topography, from enfilading fire. You also might notice that the ground sort of slopes up and away from us here. We're in a little bit of a bowl area standing down here in this swale. So as Upton attacks across the open field, he will not have to deal with direct fire coming into the front of his column. He's protected. He's utilizing the terrain to his advantage as he makes the assault here on May 10th. But with that, let's take a walk and follow in Upton's footsteps across the field and up into the Confederate works. You remember, you're with the American Battlefield Trust. Like, subscribe, share our videos. Head over to our website, battlefields.org, to learn more about preservation and our current and ongoing efforts. We're an organization that's dedicated to preserving the battlefields, the hallowed ground of the American Revolution, the War of 1812, and of course, the American Civil War. We have a ton of free content on our website, great curriculums to be utilized, and other great content to be utilized by teachers. We also, obviously, if you're here on our YouTube channel, we've got hundreds, perhaps thousands of YouTube videos that you can spend just hours on a weekend binge watching if you're into American history. Now, getting back to the battle, it's the evening of May 10th, just after 6:10, and Emory Upton is taking his 12 regiments across this field. Then we're retracing that attack right now up toward the Confederate position. If you look off to the left, you can see the ridge where the Bloody Angle will eventually be located 2 days later, monument to the 49th New York, 15th New Jersey, and barely over to the left, you can see the top of the monument to the 126th Ohio. But what is also interesting here, going back to our discussion of topography, is that once Upton gets up here, he's on a ridge. He's got another ridge just behind him. The Confederates and James Walker's Stonewall Brigade can't turn to their left and fire uphill to Upton lest they endanger the men farther down in these trenches. So another way that Upton has planned out this attack, really trying to take advantage of the topography and take every advantage he possibly can as he's massed his men and brought them across this field. Let's head on over into the Confederate works.
Yeah, one Georgian said that the Northerners came on us with a yell and never made any halt. So that kind of surprised them that they didn't stop and fire at them. They just kept up, coming up and over top of the earthworks. And we're just about to enter inside of the earthworks here, pretty much on the right and left of the camera. Where this grass ends, that is roughly where the Confederate earthen fortifications would have sat. They collapsed in and amongst themselves over the years. They're not weatherproof. These are temporary fortifications. So whenever you come out here to Spotsylvania, they look like low mounds.
Yeah, and as Upton had initially planned, the 5th Maine, once they get up and over the earthworks, there's going to be a brief period of hand-to-hand combat. They're going to turn to their left, and they're going to start pushing up toward that ridge where the Bloody Angle is located. They're going to collapse the 4th and 5th Virginia, I believe, from the Stonewall Brigade. Maybe the 2nd Virginia is in there as well. But the Stonewall Brigade, their left flank is going to be obliterated as the men from Maine push on up toward that ridge. At the same time, the 96th Pennsylvania, 121st New York, they're going to get up over the earthworks. They're going to turn to their right. You can see the position of, or one of the positions of, Benjamin Smith's Richmond howitzers just there in the distance beyond the bend in the road. The Pennsylvanians, the New Yorkers, are going to push down, capture those guns, and then the second line is going to follow up and over the earthworks. Emory Upton, as Chris mentioned during this attack, is very conspicuous. He rides out here on horseback. He's going to leap his horse over the works and continue into somewhere out into this field. He's actually going to get to an intermediary line of works that's out in this field as he pushes his regiments up and brings them into this area immediately out in front of the camera and off toward the MPS maintenance building that you can probably see there in the distance. But at the same time, as successful as this attack initially is, Upton is going to stir up a hornet's nest. He's going to punch a hole like he had intended in the Confederate line. But there's many more Confederate brigades out in the middle of the muleshoe and farther back along what is known as Lee's last line. And the Confederates are going to begin to rally, and they're going to begin to counterattack, coming from essentially all three directions that you see out here. Men from Allegheny Johnson's division is going to attack from the other side of the muleshoe salient. You have Confederates attacking up through this area directly toward us, and again sealing off the right end of the line. They're going to begin, the Confederates, pushing up toward this area, trying to seal again Upton off. And we talked a little bit about this in the wilderness in one of our previous videos, that there's going to be another Lee or several Lee to the rear incidents out here. Once again, as had happened just 4 days earlier on May 6, 1864 in the wilderness, Robert E. Lee is going to see his lines broken and his soldiers running pell-mell for the rear. It's a very grave situation, a situation where Lee feels that he needs to take more of a firmer hand and firm control of, and he's going to ride out into this field, somewhere in this area, somewhere around the area of the Harrison House, in an attempt to personally lead a counterattack. But just as the Texans had done earlier in the wilderness, those Confederate soldiers are going to grab the reins of Traveler Lee's horse and direct Lee back to the rear, shouting, "Lee to the rear, Lee to the rear." Eventually, those Confederate counterattacks are going to begin to close in on this area. Upton's going to ride back to the tree line looking for the Vermonters, only to find that the Vermonters have come forward. They've joined in this assault. Upton's going to ride back to the Confederate position. He's going to start pulling his regiments in and back to the works. I think he's trying to make one final stand at the works in the hopes that support may be coming, which indeed, as we talked about earlier in the video, it is not. The attack's going to last roughly about 2 hours. Upton is going to withdraw back into the Union lines, steadily withdrawing into the Union lines, roughly around 8:30, 8:45, 9 o'clock. But the attack was initially successful. And that's going to a certain degree, influence the thinking of George Meade and Ulysses S. Grant, especially Ulysses S. Grant. He's seen one successful attack on this front against the muleshoe salient on the evening of May 10th. And so Grant begins putting into formation plans late on the night of the 10th into early in the morning of the 11th for another bigger attack to take place as he envisions on the morning of the 12th. And to wrap this video up, I'm going to bring Chris White back on.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I want to take just a walk across the street. I want to read you a couple accounts that took place over here. Emory Upton, and stop here before we go across the street. Let this lady pass. Emory Upton was over in this area, and he said, "Here occurred a deadly hand-to-hand conflict. The enemy sitting in their pits with their pieces upright, loaded with fixed bayonets, ready to impale the first who should leap over, absolutely refused to yield the ground." So what he's describing is there are Georgians in this front line. They have fixed bayonets on their muskets, and they have actually put them upwards, basically on a 45-ish degree angle, so to meet the oncoming human wave assault of Emory Upton's men. So they would impale them as they came over to the top. The Federals themselves jump up on top of the works. They throw, like javelins, some of their rifled muskets down into here with bayonets. Other Confederates will put their guns over the top, as will Union soldiers firing at point-blank range. This is very, very deadly work going on over here. One man from the 49th Pennsylvania talked about a rebel lieutenant who actually had surrendered, and they start sending more than 1,000 or almost 1,000 Confederates to the rear as prisoners. As they start to send these men to the rear, one of the rebels, he said, "Here a rebel lieutenant, after passing to the rear, ordered his men to pick up the guns that our dead and wounded have left on the field and fire on us from the rear. Sergeant Sam Steiner of Company F, 49th Pennsylvania, hears the order, and as quick as lightning, he puts a ball into the rebel's back. who threw his hands up and dropped to the ground. That stopped the picking up of guns and shooting our men. So we see that the rebels, even though they've given up here, have been a little bit duplicitous and try to pick up guns and shoot their captors in the back as they're fighting up here. So they put an end to that. A man from the Richmond Howitzers, a Confederate, said, "We poured a few rounds of canister into their ranks when we were ordered to cease firing, and our men are charging. At a second glance, they noticed that the Confederates had no muskets. What they thought were the Confederates were charging into the field, but what they realized is a whole group of them had actually surrendered. A second's glance sufficed to show us that they had surrendered without firing a shot and were going to the rear as fast as their cowardly legs would carry them. Again, we sprang to our guns and put in a shot anyway and anywhere we could, but no artillerist could stem the torrent now nor wipe away the foul stain upon the fair banner of Confederate valor." So even out here, they see their own men retreating. At first, they thought they were charging. Don't fire into them. Wait, they're cowards. Fire into them, because they're retreating, or they gave up and fighting up here. So think about that. These men who have given up, who are fighting hand to hand, now have surrendered, and now are being shot by their own men, by artillery pieces. Andy, let's walk across the street to finish up. Over here in this area will be Richard Ewell riding into this clearing known as the Neil McCool clearing, or the McCool House clearing. And as he rides into this area, Richard Ewell is one-legged. He's on his horseback. He can be strapped to his horse. They said he could ride along he could ride a horse as well as anyone, like a cowboy along the plains. That's how well he could ride a horse. And he is going to scream to his men, "Don't run, boys. I will have enough men here in 5 minutes to eat up every damned one of them." And Ewell will be out here trying to rectify the situation. He'll pull men from his left, including Stephen Ramseur's North Carolina Brigade, swing them into this opening, and he will try to seal off any incursion from this point of the Federals. By the end of the battle, though, what happens is the Confederates will start getting in on the ends. They will start surrounding these Federals, pushing them back from whence they came. Some soldiers talked about what happened that evening. They said that a Confederate band moved up to an elevated position somewhere over in this area and started playing "Nearer, My God, to Thee." The sound of this beautiful piece of music had scarcely died away when a Yankee band over the line gave us "The Dead March," playing from that direction. This was closely played by the Confederate band playing "Bonnie Blue Flag." As the last notes were wafted onto the crisp night air, a grand old-style rebel yell went up. The Yankee band then played the "Star-Spangled Banner," and it seemed by response yelled that every man in the Army of the Potomac was awake and listening to the music. The Confederate band then rendered "Home Sweet Home," when a united yell from both sides went up in concert from the men. So what we see out here is a battle that brought them to blows, mortal blows. And then as they start to withdraw, we have a band concert playing out here and a battle of the bands, as it were. And then that music helped to draw them back together. But the killing out here at Spotsylvania had just begun. And Emory Upton will capture more than 900 enlisted men and another 37 officers from this portion of the line. But more importantly, what this is going to show Ulysses S. Grant and the Federal High Command, that this salient was a weak point. What we did with a brigade today of about 5,000 infantry, really a division as we would call it, what could we do at a more vulnerable point, the tip of that muleshoe salient, with 20,000 men of the 2nd Army Corps, which is turning into Grant's strike force here in the Overland campaign, which he is going to waste away over the next few weeks. So what we're going to do is we're going to wrap up this video here. We're going to pick up the story of Spotsylvania Courthouse with the assault on the muleshoe salient, and then with a video on the defense of the Bloody Angle, which is a small portion of this much larger salient position here at Spotsylvania Courthouse. I'm Chris White with the American Battlefield Trust. I want to thank Dan Davis, Sarah Byerly, who's back there behind the camera, Andy, who's behind the camera, and thank you for watching. Please click that like and subscribe button, and of course head over to battlefields.org to learn more about what we do. On behalf of the Trust, thank you for watching, and thank you for supporting battlefield education and preservation.
Hello, this is Trace Atkins. To stay up to date on all the latest and coolest videos, please subscribe to the Trust YouTube channel. Preserve, educate, inspire.